When Jackson Miller's last desperate attempt to salvage his bankruptcy-stricken farm unearthed an ancient stone chamber beneath his failing cornfields, he never imagined that archaeological teams would descend upon his property by nightfall, or that his discovery would contain priceless historical artifacts that historians believed had been lost to the world centuries ago. What happened next would not only rescue his family from financial ruin, but unearth forgotten cultural treasures that would revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian civilizations across rural America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The autumn sun cast long shadows across Willow Creek valleys, parched landscape, as Jackson Miller examined the antiquated excavation equipment he'd borrowed with the last of his dwindling savings. At 43, the deep furrows etched across his weathered forehead told the story of countless pre-dawn mornings and late nights, of a man who had stubbornly chosen to follow his instincts when everyone from bank loan officers to agricultural experts told him to abandon his land to corporate developers. "One last chance," he muttered, adjusting the aged backhoe that his neighbor had reluctantly lent him. "That's all I'm asking for." The devastating economic downturn had entered its fourth year in Willow Creek Valley. Once thriving family farms now resembled abandoned ghost properties, with rusting equipment and foreclosure notices marking the steady surrender of generational homesteads to Amberwood Development Corporation. Without sustainable income, traditional farming had become financially impossible, and the market prices for crops had dropped to historic lows, turning neighboring communities into modern ghost towns. Jackson's pickup truck, its once blue paint, now sun-bleached and peeling, sat beside the excavation equipment he'd managed to assemble. The hand-carved wooden sign reading "Miller Family Farm, EST 1897" hung crookedly at his property entrance, much like Jackson standing in the community since he'd refused multiple buyout offers from Amberwood Development, offers that had grown increasingly generous as the recession deepened and most farmers capitulated. Inside his farmhouse kitchen the previous evening, Jackson had studied faded property maps while the radio announced another wave of farm foreclosures approaching. His bank statement lay open beside him, 2476. 4 years ago, before the economic collapse, he'd been debt-free with 180 acres under cultivation. The Miller farm had been known for consistent yields of corn, soybeans, and wheat, reliable enough to maintain their respected place in the farming community. "Another farm foreclosure announced today," the radio announcer had said solemnly. "The Thompson place sold to Amberwood Development Corporation, the 9th family farm acquired by the conglomerate this season." Jackson had switched off the radio, his jaw tightening. Bill Thompson had been farming for 30 years. If he couldn't survive this economic crisis, what chance did any independent farmer have? The answer might lie in the yellow document spread across Jackson's table. His grandfather had died 7 years ago at the age of 94, leaving behind not just the farm, but a collection of unusual historical journals and hand-drawn maps from his time working with a Smithsonian expedition during the 1950s. Among the papers was a curious survey of the Miller property with markings his grandfather had never explained, including a precisely noted location marked only with the cryptic label "Elder Stones." With the farm's survival hanging by a thread, Jackson had made a decision that his neighbors considered the final proof of his desperation. Instead of selling off the remaining acreage to developers, where financial advisors indicated the highest return, he would excavate exactly where his grandfather's mysterious marking indicated, despite it being on higher ground, where conventional wisdom said no valuable discovery would be found. "You're throwing away good money after bad, Jack," his brother Daniel had told him just yesterday, leaning against the fence line. "That excavation equipment costs $200 a day to rent. Grandpa's old maps aren't going to save you when the bank comes calling." The county historical preservation officer had been even more direct. "Mr. Miller, archaeological surveys are clear. There's no significant historical site in that section of your property. I strongly advise you to reconsider before wasting what resources you have left." But Jackson persisted, guided by both desperation and an inexplicable trust in his grandfather's puzzling notation. For 2 days, the backhoe had dug deeper through layers of soil and hard-packed clay, going far deeper than a typical excavation would require. Neighbors drove by slowly, shaking their heads at what they saw as the last irrational act of a failing farmer. Then, on the morning of the 3rd day, at a depth of nearly 12 feet, far deeper than any normal agricultural activity would reach, the equipment suddenly struck something solid. The distinctive sound of metal against stone rang out across the quiet field. Jackson quickly shut down the backhoe, fearing he'd damaged both the equipment and whatever lay beneath. His heart pounding, Jackson grabbed a shovel and began carefully clearing away soil by hand. As more of the object was revealed, he realized he'd uncovered what appeared to be a large, flat stone, not natural to the landscape, but clearly shaped by human hands. After an hour of painstaking work, Jackson had exposed a massive stone slab with strange carvings around its edges. "What in the world?" Jackson whispered, his voice barely audible over the rustling cornfields surrounding the excavation site. The backhoe hadn't just hit bedrock. It had uncovered what appeared to be a man-made structure, a deliberately constructed stone chamber that had been hidden beneath the Miller farm for centuries, its existence unknown even to Jackson's father. With trembling fingers, Jackson called his brother Daniel. "You need to come over right now," he said urgently. "Bring your camera and that archaeology book from your college days. You're not going to believe what Grandpa's map led to." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. By late afternoon, Jackson and Daniel had carefully removed the stone slab, revealing a narrow opening into darkness below. What they found inside the underground chamber left them speechless. Row upon row of artifact-filled clay vessels, walls decorated with faded paintings, and stone tables bearing the unmistakable insignia of a civilization neither brother recognized. "Jack," Daniel whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space, "what exactly did Grandpa know about this place?" Before Jackson could answer, his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The screen showed a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Miller," said an official-sounding voice when he answered, "this is Dr. Eliza Santiago with the National Historical Preservation Society. We've detected an unauthorized excavation of a potentially significant archaeological site on your property. I need to advise you to cease all activities immediately and secure the entrance. A team is en route to your location. Please do not touch or disturb anything further until they arrive." Jackson and Daniel exchanged stunned glances in the dim light of their flashlights. "How did they know?" Daniel mouthed silently. By nightfall, what Jackson had discovered would attract attention far beyond his struggling farm, attention that would arrive unannounced under cover of darkness, with implications neither he nor anyone in Willow Creek Valley could have imagined. The secret beneath the Miller farm was about to change everything. As darkness fell over Willow Creek Valley, Jackson and Daniel Miller sat in tense silence at the kitchen table, the excavation site visible through the window where they had hastily covered the opening with plywood and an old tarp. The brothers had followed Dr. Santiago's instructions to exit the underground chamber, but not before taking photographs of what they'd found, images that now glowed on Daniel's laptop between them. "Those weren't ordinary artifacts down there," Daniel said, zooming in on one image, showing a row of intricately carved stone tablets with unusual symbols. "Nothing like any Native American artifacts I've ever seen in textbooks." Jackson nodded, studying another photograph. "And look at these wall paintings, some kind of star charts or celestial maps, but nothing that matches conventional archaeological finds from this region. You think this has something to do with why Grandpa insisted the farm stay in the family?" Daniel asked. "Why he made Dad promise never to sell no matter what?" Before Jackson could answer, the distant rumble of vehicles drew their attention. Headlights appeared on the long gravel road leading to the farmhouse, not one or two, but a convoy moving with precision through the darkness. The brothers stepped onto the porch, watching as 3 unmarked vans and 2 SUVs approached, their headlights cutting through the dust and darkness. "That was fast," Daniel muttered. "Too fast. They must have already been in the area." The vehicles formed a precise semicircle around the excavation site. Men and women in practical field clothing emerged silently, establishing a perimeter. With professional efficiency, from the lead SUV stepped a slender woman in her late 50s, wearing khaki pants and a buttoned shirt that nonetheless suggested authority. "Dr. Eliza Santiago," Jackson presumed. "Mr. Miller," the woman called, approaching the porch with a direct, measured stride. "I appreciate your cooperation. I'm Dr. Santiago. We spoke earlier." Jackson stepped forward, meeting the archaeologist at the bottom of the porch steps. "How did you know about the excavations so quickly? We only discovered that chamber a few hours ago." Santiago's expression remained carefully neutral. "The region has monitoring systems that, while limited, remain operational. When you uncovered the chamber entrance, it triggered an alert protocol established decades ago when your grandfather participated in the initial survey." A younger man emerged from one of the vehicles, joining them with equipment cases and a tablet similar to what Jackson had seen university researchers use during previous visits to the area. He wore a dark blue jacket with no visible insignia, his prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "Dr. Marcus Vega, Indigenous Cultures Division," he introduced himself briskly. "I'll need to see exactly how you accessed the chamber and what areas you've disturbed." His tone carried an unmistakable note of accusation, as if Jackson had deliberately trespassed rather than accidentally discovering a historical site on his own land. "Hold on," Jackson said, his farmers' patience beginning to fray. "This is my property. My family has owned this land since 1897. No one ever told us there was a whatever this is buried under our cornfield." Santiago's eyes narrowed slightly. "Was your grandfather Harold Miller, formerly research assistant to Professor James Whittaker of the Smithsonian Mesoamerican Studies program?" The question caught Jackson off guard. Yes, but he never talked much about his research work, said he was just a digger and note-taker. A flicker of something, respect perhaps, crossed the archaeologist's face. Your grandfather was considerably more than just a note-taker, Mr. Miller, but we can discuss that later. Right now, we need to secure the site and assess any potential deterioration from the exposure. As they spoke, more personnel emerged from the vehicles, some carrying specialized equipment, others setting up lighting systems and temporary shelters. Portable lights were being positioned around the excavation site, transforming the normally dark farm into a blazing island of activity visible for miles across the flat landscape. "What exactly is down there?" Daniel asked, joining them. "We saw artifacts, wall paintings, but nothing that looked particularly valuable." Dr. Vega exchanged a glance with Santiago before answering. "The Willow Creek repository contains cultural artifacts developed during the pre-Columbian period as part of what we now believe was a previously unknown civilization. The chamber was officially documented in 1953 and was scheduled for careful excavation, but political complications arose. All materials were supposed to have been catalogued and relocated to the Smithsonian. Clearly they missed some things, Jackson observed dryly. "Not missed, Mr. Miller," Santiago corrected. "Deliberately preserved, and based on your photographs, preserved with remarkable success." Their conversation was interrupted by a call from one of the team members who had been examining the site with ground-penetrating radar equipment. "Dr. Santiago, we've established the chamber parameters. The structure extends well beyond the initial opening. Dr. Vega can begin his assessment." Santiago nodded. "Mr. Miller, I'd like you to accompany us. Your grandfather's involvement with this site may be relevant to understanding its current condition." This request, though phrased as such, carried the unmistakable weight of an order. Jackson hesitated, glancing at Daniel, who gave a slight nod. "I'll stay here and keep an eye on things," Daniel said. "Someone should make sure our property is respected." The emphasis on the word property wasn't subtle. Jackson followed Santiago and Dr. Vega to the excavation site, where the plywood cover had been removed and replaced with a more substantial metal frame supporting powerful lighting. One of the team members handed Jackson protective gloves and a helmet with an attached light. "Stay between us, please," Dr. Vega instructed as they prepared to descend. "Touch nothing without permission." The descent into the chamber was tight, but manageable with the equipment the team had brought. When they emerged into the underground space, the scene was dramatically different from Jackson's earlier exploration. Powerful lights now illuminated what turned out to be an enormous chamber, far larger than he and Daniel had realized in the limited beam of their flashlights. "My God!" Dr. Vega breathed, his professional detachment momentarily cracking. "It's all still here, everything." Jackson now saw clearly what had been only partially visible during his brief exploration. The underground chamber extended at least 60 feet in each direction, with ceiling heights of nearly 10 feet. Row upon row of artifacts stood in precise formation: clay vessels, stone tablets, intricately carved figurines, all arranged in what appeared to be a deliberate pattern across stone platforms. "What is all this?" Jackson asked, overwhelmed by the scale of what lay beneath his struggling farm. Santiago moved forward, running a gloved hand almost reverently over one of the larger stone tablets. The Willow Creek repository was decades ahead of anything we previously understood about pre-Columbian civilizations in this region, an attempt to document a cultural exchange that mainstream archaeology wasn't ready to accept in the 1950s. In a cultural bridge between Mesoamerican and Mississippi Valley civilizations, Dr. Vega suggested examining one of the smaller artifacts with careful attention. Among other hypotheses, Santiago confirmed, your grandfather was one of the researchers, Mr. Miller. When the project was officially terminated due to academic politics and Cold War paranoia about indigenous cultures, he apparently took extraordinary measures to protect the research. Jackson struggled to reconcile this information with the quiet, practical farmer he had known. My grandfather never mentioned any of this. He wouldn't have, Santiago said. Everyone associated with the repository was sworn to absolute secrecy. The findings here contradicted established archaeological narratives of the time, which is precisely why certain academic interests wanted the discovery suppressed. Dr. Vega was moving systematically through the chamber, documenting various artifacts with a specialized camera and consulting notes on his tablet. Remarkable preservation state, he reported. Environmental control systems still functioning at minimal levels. The natural limestone formation combined with the engineered air shafts has maintained stable humidity. No significant deterioration detected. Jackson followed them deeper into the chamber, his practical farmer's mind warring with growing astonishment. At the far end of the main space stood what appeared to be a central stone dais, a semicircular platform with unusual markings surrounding a central stone seat, almost throne-like in its construction. This would have been the ceremonial center, Santiago explained. Based on your grandfather's notes, this is where the cultural knowledge was transmitted and recorded. The positioning of artifacts around this central point tells a story of cultural exchange previously unknown to archaeology. Jackson approached the dais cautiously. Unlike the rest of the chamber, this area showed signs of more recent attention. The dust was less evident, and a leather-bound journal lay open beside one of the stone tablets. "That's my grandfather's handwriting," Jackson said, recognizing the distinctive script. Before Dr. Vega could object, he picked up the journal and began reading. October 17th, 1978. Quarterly maintenance complete. Chamber integrity remains stable. Artifact preservation at acceptable levels despite minimal environmental controls. Have adjusted the ventilation shafts to compensate for reduced efficiency. The decision to preserve the repository was the right one. The academic world isn't ready yet, but someday they'll need what we protected here. Jackson looked up from the journal, stunned. 1978. That's 25 years after the project supposedly ended. Your grandfather maintained this chamber in secret, Santiago said, her tone suggesting this revelation was as surprising to her as it was to Jackson. For decades after the official research was terminated, Dr. Vega had moved to the central dais, his fingers hovering over the inscriptions without touching them. Dr. Santiago, these markings suggest a calendar system unlike anything previously documented. The astronomical alignments are still perfectly preserved. The implications of this statement seem to heighten the tension among the archaeological personnel. Two of the team members exchanged glances, and one moved his hand subtly closer to his equipment case. "Mr. Miller," Santiago said carefully, "did your grandfather leave any other documentation? Any instructions about this chamber, or how to access its full meaning?" The deliberate casualness of the question triggered Jackson's caution. He thought of the journals and maps still in the farmhouse, documents that had suddenly become far more significant than family heirlooms. "Nothing specific," he answered, matching Santiago's careful tone. Just some old maps and personal journals, nothing that mentioned any of this directly. Dr. Vega had moved to a large stone object covered with a woven cloth at the center of the chamber. "Director, I believe this is the primary repository keystone, the central record that contextualizes all the separate artifacts." With permission from Santiago, he carefully drew back the protective covering, revealing a creation unlike anything Jackson had ever seen. At its center was a circular stone tablet made of what appeared to be polished obsidian, inscribed with concentric rings of symbols surrounding a central starburst pattern. The entire piece rested on a platform inscribed with what looked like astronomical charts and calendrical markings. The theoretical importance of this artifact, if correctly interpreted, would be enough to rewrite the entire cultural history of pre-Columbian North America, Dr. Vega explained, his scientific detachment giving way to barely contained excitement. This methodology could revolutionize our understanding of indigenous knowledge systems. Santiago's expression remained guarded. It could also destabilize established archaeological frameworks and threaten academic repositories worth decades of research funding, which is why the knowledge was buried in the first place. She turned to Jackson. "Your grandfather didn't just preserve artifacts, Mr. Miller. He protected a historical narrative that powerful academic interests had actively tried to erase from existence." Jackson thought of his struggling farm above, of his community dying under the weight of economic pressure and corporate development. "And now that it's been discovered?" he asked. "That," Santiago said gravely, "is the question we're all about to face." She gestured to her team. "Establish full perimeter security. No one enters or leaves without direct authorization. Communications blackout protocol is now in effect." As the team acknowledged these orders, Jackson realized the implications of his accidental discovery were far greater than he had imagined. What had begun as a desperate attempt to find something valuable on his land had uncovered knowledge that could either save or further endanger his family's legacy, depending on who ultimately controlled the historical narrative his grandfather had so carefully preserved. "Dr. Santiago," he said firmly, "this chamber is on Miller land. My grandfather clearly intended this knowledge to be protected by our family. I need to understand exactly what your intentions are." Santiago studied Jackson for a long moment before responding. "Your grandfather was a visionary, Mr. Miller. He saw potential in cultural knowledge that others feared or dismissed. The question now is whether the academic world is finally ready for what he helped preserve, and who gets to make that decision." From above came the sound of more vehicles arriving, their headlights sweeping across the entrance to the underground chamber as additional resources converged on the once quiet farm. The secret beneath the Miller farm was now very much exposed, and with it, the battle for control of a historical narrative that could transform our understanding of American history. Dawn broke over the Miller farm to reveal a transformed landscape. Where yesterday there had been only a struggling farmer and his borrowed excavation equipment, now stood a full archaeological encampment. White research tents surrounded the entrance to the underground chamber. Portable generators hummed steadily, and a communications array had been established near the old barn. Uniformed security personnel maintained a perimeter that extended well beyond the immediate excavation site, keeping curious neighbors at bay. Jackson sat on his porch, coffee mug in hand, watching this surreal scene unfold on land his family had farmed for generations. He hadn't slept. After emerging from the underground chamber around midnight, he'd been subjected to 3 hours of questioning by various officials before being allowed to return to his house, which was now under constant surveillance. Daniel emerged from inside, carrying his own coffee. 2 more government vehicles arrived while you were in the shower, he reported, settling into the chair beside his brother. One of them looked like it was carrying some kind of specialized preservation equipment, heavy stuff. Jackson nodded wearily. They're moving fast, too fast for this to be a complete surprise to them. You think they knew about the chamber? All along? Not necessarily, Jackson replied, but I think someone's been waiting for something like this to surface. Santiago mentioned monitoring systems that alerted them to the breach. That suggests ongoing awareness, even if the specifics were forgotten. Daniel glanced toward the house, then lowered his voice. I took the precaution of moving Grandpa's journals and maps to the old storm cellar last night, the hidden compartment behind the preserve shelves. Jackson gave his brother a grateful look. Despite their differences over the years, Daniel had left for college while Jackson stayed to work the farm. Their shared instinct for caution remained intact. Good thinking. I told Santiago I didn't have specific documentation, but I'm not sure she believed me. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a woman Jackson hadn't seen before. Civilian clothes, early 40s, with an air of academic authority rather than institutional precision. She held a tablet and what appeared to be some of his grandfather's tools that had been stored in the barn. "Mr. Miller," she called from the bottom of the porch steps. "I'm Dr. Rachel Winters, Indigenous Cultural Heritage Specialist. I was hoping I could ask you some questions about your grandfather." Jackson exchanged a glance with Daniel before responding. "Seems like everyone wants to know about Grandpa suddenly. Funny how no one cared about an old farmer's stories until yesterday." Dr. Winters smiled slightly at his defensive tone. "Actually, some of us have been studying Harold Miller's theoretical work for years, though we never knew what happened to his practical findings. Your grandfather co-authored 7 academic papers between 1948 and 1962 under the pseudonym H.M. Willow. They were considered brilliant but controversial by the archaeological establishment of the time. This information startled Jackson. His grandfather publishing academic papers, the quiet, practical man who taught him to read soil conditions and predict weather patterns, had lived a double life Jackson had never suspected. "Why don't you come up and have some coffee?" he offered, making a split-second decision to engage, rather than resist. Information flowed both ways, after all. As Dr. Winters settled on the porch with them, Jackson noted the barely concealed excitement beneath her professional demeanor. This wasn't someone sent to intimidate. This was a true believer in whatever knowledge lay beneath his fields. "Your grandfather's approach to pre-Columbian cultural exchange was revolutionary," she explained, pulling up technical documents on her tablet. He proposed integrated cultural transmission between Mesoamerican and Mississippi Valley civilizations through what he called stellar navigation exchange. The archaeological community dismissed it as theoretically unsound, but the papers themselves were methodologically rigorous. "And you think that's what's down in that chamber?" Daniel asked. "This stellar whatever you called it?" "We know it is," Dr. Winters confirmed. "The preliminary documentation from last night matches the theoretical proposals from his papers perfectly. What we don't understand is how he managed to preserve a complete repository without institutional support, or why it was hidden here instead of developed further. Jackson thought of the journal entry he'd seen in the chamber. According to what I read last night, he maintained the site until at least 1978, 25 years after the project supposedly ended. Dr. Winters leaned forward, her interest piqued. That's extraordinary. The technical challenges of keeping such an advanced archaeological site intact would have been immense, especially working alone. Who says he was alone? Daniel interjected. The question hung in the air, prompting Jackson to reconsider memories from his childhood. He recalled numerous elderly visitors who would come to see his grandfather, men and women who didn't fit the typical profile of farming neighbors. They would often disappear into his grandfather's study for hours, emerging with the satisfied looks of people who had accomplished something significant. There were others, Jackson said slowly. People who visited regularly. I always assumed they were war buddies or old friends. Fellow repository guardians, Dr. Winters suggested. A community of researchers continuing their work in secret after the official project was terminated. Before they could explore this possibility further, Dr. Santiago approached the porch, her expression suggesting urgency. Mr. Miller, Dr. Winters, she acknowledged with a nod. We've completed the initial security assessment of the chamber. I need to speak with you about what we've found. Dr. Winters rose immediately. Have you documented the central keystone? The astronomical alignments are extremely sensitive to... We haven't disturbed anything, Santiago interrupted, but we've identified something concerning. There appears to be a deterioration sequence running in one of the chamber's structural supports. Jackson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. A deterioration of what? That's what we need to determine, Santiago replied grimly. And, quickly, the degradation began shortly after our equipment established monitoring protocols inside the chamber. Dr. Winters's expression shifted from excitement to concern. It could be an automated protection protocol, a fail-safe your grandfather, built into the chamber to prevent unauthorized access or documentation. Jackson thought again of his grandfather, the meticulous farmer who planned for every contingency, from early frosts to equipment failures. Of course, he would have protected his life's secret work with similar thoroughness. Let me see my grandfather's journals, Jackson decided. If he built in security measures, he might have documented them somewhere. Daniel raised an eyebrow. I thought you told the director you didn't have specific documentation. Jackson met Santiago's gaze directly. I have family journals and personal papers. Given the circumstances, I'm willing to review them for relevant information, provided I do so privately and maintain control of the documents. A tense negotiation transpired in the silence that followed. Santiago clearly wanted unrestricted access to any information that might help them understand the chamber. Jackson, despite his growing concern about the structural deterioration, wasn't ready to surrender his grandfather's legacy to institutional control. You have 1 hour, Santiago finally conceded. If you find anything relevant to the protection systems, I expect immediate disclosure. Dr. Winters can assist if archaeological interpretation is needed. Once Santiago had returned to the excavation site, Daniel retrieved the journals from their hiding place. The brothers, joined by Dr. Winters, spread the materials across the kitchen table, decades of handwritten notes, diagrams, and observations chronicling an archaeological journey disguised as farming records. He used a coding system, Jackson realized, comparing entries. Look, these notations about soil composition are actually about chamber atmospheric conditions. The crop rotation schedules are maintenance timelines for different artifact groups. Dr. Winters leaned over the journals with growing excitement. This is brilliant. He documented everything but in agricultural terms that would seem mundane to anyone who didn't know what to look for. As they translated the coded entries, a clear picture emerged of Harold Miller's extraordinary achievement. The repository hadn't been merely preserved. It had been refined and improved over decades of secret work. What lay beneath the farm wasn't just a historical relic of 1950s archaeology, but a continuously evolved understanding of pre-Columbian cultural exchange. "Here," Daniel said suddenly, pointing to an entry from 1984. "Listen to this. Implemented. Verification protocol to prevent access without proper authorization. Sequential authentication required. Bloodline verification, physical keystone alignment, and knowledge component. Without all three elements, the chamber protection mechanism activates." Jackson felt a growing certainty. The structural deterioration, it's a protection mechanism triggered because they connected monitoring equipment to the chamber without proper authentication. Dr. Winters was rapidly taking notes. "Does he specify what happens when the deterioration completes?" Daniel continued reading. "Primary support pillars will release accumulated pressure, causing controlled chamber collapse. Better to lose the physical evidence than allow it to be misinterpreted or exploited for personal advancement. He built a self-destruct system," Jackson said, equal parts impressed and alarmed. "If we don't authenticate properly before that deterioration completes, everything in the chamber will be destroyed." Dr. Winters was already on her feet. "We need to tell Santiago immediately. How much time remains in the deterioration sequence?" "Approximately 53 minutes, came a voice from the doorway. They turned to find Santiago standing there, her expression grim. Behind her stood two men in formal attire who hadn't been part of the original team. Their demeanor suggested authority, beyond even Santiago's considerable presence. "Mr. Miller," said the older of the two men, stepping forward, "I'm Professor Richard Blackwood of the American Archaeological Institute's Special Collections Division. The situation has escalated beyond Dr. Santiago's purview." Jackson felt the subtle shift in power dynamics. Santiago's slight stiffening confirmed that these men represented authority even she was bound to respect. "We've reviewed the preliminary documentation of the repository contents," Blackwood continued. "Its potential academic impact is significant enough to warrant executive-level attention. I've been authorized to offer you a comprehensive agreement that addresses both historical preservation concerns and your family's interests." "What kind of agreement?" Jackson asked, instantly wary. "Full compensation for your property at 5 times market value, a consulting position with the Institute, and a confidentiality arrangement that would preclude any public discussion of what's been discovered here." The second man stepped forward, opening a briefcase to reveal official documents. "We're prepared to process everything immediately." Jackson looked at the papers, then at his grandfather's journals spread across the table, the carefully coded record of a lifelong commitment to protecting revolutionary historical knowledge until the academic world was ready for it. "And the archaeological findings?" he asked. "What happens to my grandfather's work?" Blackwood's careful neutrality slipped slightly. "That would become classified academic property, subject to evaluation and potential publication through appropriate institutional channels." "Appropriate channels," Jackson repeated, "meaning controlled by whatever academic interests currently dominate archaeological policy." "Meaning handled responsibly, with full consideration of historical implications," Blackwood countered, smoothly. Dr. Winters, who had been silent during this exchange, finally spoke. "Professor, with respect, we have less than an hour before the Chamber's protection systems activate. Perhaps addressing the immediate crisis should take priority." "Over property negotiations?" Blackwood's cold glance suggested he wasn't accustomed to being redirected, but he acknowledged the urgency. "Dr. Santiago mentioned a 3-part authentication system. What do we know about it?" Jackson weighed his options carefully. The deterioration presented an immediate threat to his grandfather's legacy. If the system self-destructed, the historical knowledge would be lost forever. Yet surrendering complete control to institutional authorities contradicted everything his grandfather had worked to prevent. "The journal mentions 3 components," he said finally: bloodline verification, physical keystone alignment, and knowledge component. I might be able to determine what these refer to, but not with institutional representatives looking over my shoulder and a team of strangers swarming through my property." Blackwood's expression hardened. "Mr. Miller, this is not a negotiation. Historical preservation security is exactly what my grandfather was protecting," Jackson interrupted. "He kept this chamber hidden because he understood that true security doesn't come from institutional control, but from responsible stewardship." The standoff might have escalated further if not for Daniel's intervention. "What my brother means," he said diplomatically, "is that we want the same outcome you do, preventing the chamber from self-destructing, but decoding our grandfather's authentication system will require family knowledge that only we possess. We need space to work through his journals without pressure." Blackwood and Santiago exchanged glances, clearly calculating risks and alternatives. 30 minutes, Blackwood finally conceded. "After that, we move to more aggressive stabilization methods, regardless of potential damage to the artifacts." As the officials withdrew to consult with their technical teams, Jackson turned back to the journals with renewed urgency. Somewhere in his grandfather's coded writings lay the key to preserving or destroying a historical legacy that could transform our understanding of America's past, and with it, the fate of the Miller farm. "You realize what this means," Daniel said quietly, once they were alone with Dr. Winters. "Grandpa didn't just build this repository, he created a fail-safe to ensure it wouldn't be controlled by the wrong people. He was willing to let his life's work be destroyed rather than misused." Jackson nodded gravely, turning pages with growing determination. "And now, we have less than an hour to decide whether the right people have finally found it." The kitchen of the Miller farmhouse had become an impromptu war room. Jackson and Daniel hunched over their grandfather's journals, frantically searching for clues to the authentication system, while Dr. Winters cross-referenced their findings with archaeological data displayed on her tablet. Outside, the archaeological encampment buzzed with increasing activity as Professor Blackwood's team prepared what they euphemistically called stabilization measures. "42 minutes remaining," Daniel said, checking his watch. "We need to work. Faster." Jackson ran his finger down a journal page dated 1987. "Here's something. He mentions a triple seal concordance that requires the blood of continuation, the key of alignment, and the knowledge of purpose." "That has to be referring to the authentication system," Dr. Winters said, leaning forward. "Those sound like metaphorical descriptions," Daniel observed. "The blood of continuation could be a genetic verification from a Miller family descendant." "That makes sense," Jackson agreed. "But what about the key of alignment?" Dr. Winters studied the journal entry thoughtfully. "In archaeological contexts, alignment often refers to astronomical positioning. The central keystone had concentric rings with what appeared to be star charts. Perhaps it needs to be physically rotated to a specific position." Jackson thought back to his childhood, to evenings spent with his grandfather in the old observatory shed behind the barn. "The stars," he said suddenly. "Grandpa was obsessed with astronomy. Said a good farmer always reads the night sky." He looked up excitedly. The observatory shed still standing. "We haven't used it much since Grandpa died, but all his equipment should still be there." "Go," Dr. Winters urged. "Check for any star charts or celestial mapping tools that might correlate with the keystone markings." As Jackson hurried out, a sharp knock at the kitchen door announced Dr. Santiago's return. She entered without waiting for permission, her expression a careful mask, hiding whatever tensions existed between archaeological and institutional authorities. "Blackwood's technical team is preparing a structural reinforcement," she reported. "They believe it might interrupt the deterioration sequence without permanently damaging the chamber architecture. Or it might trigger immediate collapse," Dr. Winters countered. "We can't risk that approach until we've exhausted the authentication option." Daniel kept his focus on the journals. "We're making progress. We've identified the first component. The blood of continuation is likely a genetic verification from a Miller family descendant." Santiago nodded, seeming genuinely relieved. "Good. What about the other components?" "Still working on those," Daniel replied deliberately, withholding details until they better understood what they were dealing with. His grandfather had gone to extraordinary lengths to protect this knowledge. The Millers wouldn't surrender it easily. The kitchen door banged open as Jackson returned, cradling a dusty wooden box containing several aged star charts and a peculiar brass instrument. "Found them," he announced triumphantly. "Grandpa's astronomical alignment tools, with dates corresponding to the chamber's construction." As Jackson arranged the star charts on the table, Professor Blackwood appeared in the doorway, flanked by two technical specialists carrying equipment cases. "Mr. Miller," he began without preamble, "our window for non-destructive intervention is closing. I need to know exactly what progress you've made." Jackson straightened, meeting Blackwood's gaze directly. "We've identified the bloodline component of the authentication system and located what appear to be the necessary astronomical alignment tools. My brother is working on the knowledge component." Blackwood glanced at his specialists. "We can use our equipment to calculate the astronomical alignments more efficiently." "No," Jackson said firmly. "My grandfather deliberately used analog technology to prevent modern interference. We follow his protocols exactly or risk triggering the collapse." The tension in the room escalated as Blackwood clearly considered overriding Jackson's decision. Before he could respond, one of his specialists received an alert on her device. "Sir, the deterioration has accelerated," she reported urgently. "We're down to 28 minutes, not the 35 we projected." "The system is adaptive," Dr. Winters realized. "It's responding to our activities by adjusting its timeline." Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Miller, we're running out of options. If that chamber collapses, we lose potentially world-changing historical knowledge. And if we trigger the collapse by ignoring my grandfather's protocols, we get the same result," Jackson countered. "Let us work." Daniel had moved to a different journal, his expression intensifying as he read. "Jack, I think I've found the knowledge component. Listen to this passage from 2002. The final protection remains philosophical, not technical. Only those who understand why the knowledge matters, not merely what it contains, can truly be trusted with its preservation. The question is carved where only a seeker would look." Dr. Winters nodded excitedly. "I noticed an inscription on the underside of the central keystone platform, something about true history and balanced understanding. Could that be the prompt for the knowledge component?" "Likely," Jackson agreed. "Grandpa always said that artifacts without context are just pretty objects. He believed in the story behind the object, not just the object itself." With renewed purpose, the group gathered the authentication components. Jackson for the bloodline, verification, the astronomical charts for the physical alignment, and the journals for the knowledge component. Their improvised solution represented exactly what Harold Miller had valued: family continuity, scientific precision, and philosophical understanding coming together. Santiago led them back to the chamber entrance, where Blackwood's team had established a technical command post. Tension radiated from the assembled specialists as the deterioration timer continued its relentless countdown. 22 minutes remaining. "We'll handle this," Jackson told the watching technicians firmly. "Everyone else stays back." With Daniel and Dr. Winters beside him, Jackson descended into the chamber, now transformed by portable lighting and monitoring equipment. The deterioration was visibly progressing. Fine cracks had appeared in several of the support columns, and a subtle vibration could be felt through the stone floor. "The bloodline verification first," Dr. Winters directed, consulting the journal notes. "According to these instructions, you need to place your hand on the family mark at the chamber entrance." Jackson approached the chamber doorway, noticing for the first time a small hand-shaped impression carved into the stone lintel. The size and shape seemed eerily perfect for his hand, or more precisely, for a Miller family hand, with its distinctive broad palm and slightly longer ring finger. "Our family's hands," he murmured, remembering his grandfather's frequent comment about Miller men having farmers' hands, going back generations. As Jackson pressed his palm against the carved impression, a slight warming sensation spread through the stone. One set of cracks in the nearest support column immediately stabilized, the deterioration halting in that section. "Bloodline verified," Dr. Winters confirmed, checking the monitoring equipment. "Now for the astronomical alignment." Daniel had already moved to the central keystone, carefully comparing its circular markings with their grandfather's star charts. According to these charts, the keystone should be aligned to reflect the night sky as it appeared over this exact location on December 21st, 1897. The day our family first acquired this land. With painstaking precision, Daniel rotated the massive stone disc, aligning its carved stellar patterns with the configuration shown in their grandfather's meticulous charts. As the final alignment clicked into place, another support column stabilized, its spreading cracks halting abruptly. "Two down," Dr. Winters announced. "The knowledge component is all that remains." Jackson circled the central platform, examining its underside as Dr. Winters had suggested. There, carved in fading letters that would only be visible to someone deliberately searching, was an inscription. "What purpose does knowledge serve if locked away from those who need it most?" The philosophical question resonated with everything Jackson knew about his grandfather. A man who had straddled two worlds, academic and agricultural, always believing that knowledge belonged in working hands, not ivory towers. The answer isn't written down anywhere, Jackson realized. This is the test. What would Grandpa say knowledge is for? The three exchanged glances as the chamber continued its subtle deterioration around them. The countdown had reached 15 minutes. "Your grandfather dedicated his life to preserving this knowledge against institutional pressure," Dr. Winters observed. "What drove him to such extraordinary lengths?" Jackson thought of Harold Miller, the complex man who had balanced archaeological discovery with practical farming, who had maintained a world-changing historical site in secret for decades, who had taught his grandsons to value truth over authority, understanding over credentials. "Knowledge serves truth, not power," Jackson said firmly, addressing the chamber directly. "It belongs to humanity, not institutions." The effect was immediate. The remaining cracks in the support columns stabilized, and the subtle vibration ceased entirely. A momentary shimmer seemed to pass through the chamber's atmosphere, and then stability returned. The monitoring equipment showed all deterioration processes had halted. "Authentication complete," Dr. Winters breathed, her voice hushed with both relief and reverence. "The chamber has accepted you as its rightful steward." From above came sounds of surprise and confusion as Blackwood's team registered the sudden stabilization on their monitoring equipment. Jackson looked around the chamber, his grandfather's legacy preserved not just in the artifacts themselves, but in the principles that had protected them. Dr. Santiago descended the entrance ladder, her expression a mixture of relief and professional curiosity. "The deterioration has completely reversed," she reported. "Whatever you did worked perfectly." Behind her came Professor Blackwood, his institutional authority temporarily humbled by the chamber's remarkable response to the Miller family's intervention. "Most impressive, Mr. Miller," he acknowledged stiffly. "It appears your grandfather built not just physical protections, but philosophical ones as well." Jackson nodded, a new resolve forming within him. The chamber had recognized him as its legitimate steward, but with that recognition came responsibility, not just to preserve the artifacts, but to ensure they served their intended purpose. "Let me be clear, Professor," he said, his farmer's practicality infusing his words with quiet authority. "This chamber and its contents remain under Miller family stewardship. Any research, documentation, or publication will happen with our full involvement and approval." Blackwood's expression tightened. "Mr. Miller, while I appreciate your family connection, these artifacts represent potentially revolutionary historical knowledge. They cannot remain under private control." "They're not under private control," Jackson corrected. "They're under responsible stewardship, exactly what my grandfather intended. The chamber recognized that distinction, even if your institution doesn't. Dr. Santiago stepped forward, her practical nature asserting itself. Perhaps a compromise would serve all interests. The Miller family maintains legal ownership and stewardship rights, while the Institute provides conservation resources and academic documentation with publications requiring mutual approval. The negotiation that followed transformed the underground chamber from a battleground of competing interests to a collaborative space where institutional resources and family stewardship could potentially coexist. Not unlike the cultural exchange the artifacts themselves represented. As they emerged from the chamber into the late afternoon sunlight, Jackson saw the archaeological encampment with new eyes. What had initially felt like an invasion now represented possibility, the potential for his grandfather's preserved knowledge to finally serve its intended purpose, not through institutional appropriation, but through a new model of collaborative understanding. Daniel joined him, gazing at the transformed farm landscape. "Grandpa would be proud," he said quietly. "Not just that we preserved the chamber, but how we did it." Jackson nodded, the weight of his family's legacy settling on his shoulders not as a burden, but as a responsibility freely accepted. "Knowledge serves truth, not power," he repeated softly. "That's what will save the farm, and maybe change how we understand history itself." As the sun began to set over the Miller farm, casting long shadows across fields that had nearly been lost to bankruptcy and development, the brothers stood together at the threshold of a new chapter, not just for their family, but for the understanding of America's ancient past. The desperate last attempt to save a family farm had uncovered something far more valuable than mere financial salvation. It had revealed a path forward built on the integration of different ways of knowing, much like the ancient cultural exchange their grandfather had fought to preserve. 3 months after Jackson Miller's accidental discovery of the underground chamber, Willow Creek Valley had transformed in ways no one could have predicted. The Miller farm, once on the brink of foreclosure, now stood as the centerpiece of the newly established North American Indigenous Exchange Research Center. The weathered farmhouse had been carefully restored, while a modern research facility had been constructed alongside the original barn, blending traditional architecture with cutting-edge preservation technology. Jackson stood on his porch, watching a convoy of vehicles approach along the gravel road. Unlike the tense arrival of archaeological officials months earlier, today's visitors were expected and welcome. The lead vehicle bore the emblem of the Smithsonian Institution, while those behind carried representatives from tribal nations across North America and visiting researchers from universities worldwide. Quite a change from the days when we couldn't afford seed for next season, Daniel observed, joining his brother on the porch. Having taken a leave of absence from his teaching position, he now served as the center's educational director. Jackson nodded, recalling the desperate financial straits that had driven him to that final excavation attempt. Grandfather always said adversity reveals opportunity to those willing to look beyond conventional wisdom, he replied, watching the vehicles park in the newly constructed visitor area. He just never mentioned the opportunity would be hiding 12 feet underground. The transformation of the Miller farm from failing agricultural operation to groundbreaking research center had occurred with remarkable speed, propelled by the extraordinary significance of the chamber's contents. Once the initial power struggles had been resolved through the establishment of the Miller Family Trust, which maintained stewardship authority over all artifacts and research, the collaborative potential of the discovery had flourished. Dr. Santiago emerged from the lead vehicle, now serving as the center's archaeological director. Behind her came representatives from 5 tribal nations, whose ancestral connections to the chamber's contents had been established through the astronomical alignments and symbolic patterns documented in the artifacts. The Norwegian team arrived last night, Daniel mentioned, as they descended the porch steps to greet their visitors. Their runestone experts are particularly interested in the inscription similarities between their medieval artifacts and our pre-Columbian stones. Jackson nodded, still adjusting to the center's rapid emergence as a global nexus for re-examining cultural exchange theories that had once been dismissed as fringe speculation. His grandfather's carefully preserved repository had provided concrete evidence that contact between indigenous North American cultures and other civilizations may have occurred far earlier and with greater complexity than conventional archaeology had acknowledged. "Mr. Miller," Dr. Santiago called warmly as they approached, "the carbon dating results from the central platform materials have confirmed our preliminary findings. The chamber construction dates to approximately 1215 CE, centuries earlier than any previously documented astronomical calendar of this sophistication in the Mississippi Valley region." The significance of this announcement wasn't lost on Jackson. Each new verification further validated his grandfather's controversial theories about early cultural exchange, theories that had once cost Harold Miller his academic reputation. "He would be pleased," Jackson replied simply, accepting the formal report, "not for personal vindication, but because the truth matters more than established narratives." The group moved toward the modern research facility that now housed the carefully relocated artifacts. After the authentication process had stabilized the chamber, ground-penetrating radar had revealed concerning geological instabilities beneath the original site, natural processes that would eventually have compromised the chamber regardless of human intervention. After extensive consultation with preservation experts and tribal representatives, the difficult decision had been made to document the chamber exhaustively and relocate its contents to a purpose-built facility nearby. The Norwegian delegation is particularly interested in the star navigation markings, Dr. Winters explained as they entered the climate-controlled main hall. Now serving as the center's cultural interpretation specialist, she had become an essential bridge between academic researchers and indigenous knowledge keepers. The similarities to Norse maritime navigation techniques can't be dismissed as coincidental. The relocation had revealed additional elements not visible during the initial discovery, including a sealed cavity beneath the central platform, containing preserved organic materials that provided unprecedented insights into the chamber's origins. Inside the research center, the relocated artifacts had been arranged in a configuration that honored their original positioning while making them accessible for careful study. The central keystone dominated the main hall, its concentric rings and stellar markings now illuminated by specialized lighting that revealed details invisible under conventional observation. Standing before this remarkable artifact, surrounded by experts who had traveled from around the world to witness it firsthand, Jackson felt a profound sense of responsibility mingled with vindication. His grandfather's decades of solitary stewardship had preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever to institutional politics and academic orthodoxy. We've identified 7 distinct writing systems represented in the chamber artifacts, reported Dr. Vega, now heading the linguistic analysis team. 3 correspond to known indigenous scripts, but 4 represent previously undocumented communication systems that challenge our entire understanding of pre-Columbian literacy in North America. The visiting tribal representatives nodded in recognition. Many of their oral histories had preserved accounts of written knowledge systems that European colonization had systematically destroyed or dismissed as primitive. Histories now finding physical confirmation in the chamber's contents. This isn't just changing archaeology, noted Joseph Runningbear, elder representative from the Mandan Nation. It's changing how we understand ourselves and our ancestors. Stories dismissed as myths for centuries are proving to be historical accounts. As the group moved through the facility, examining artifacts now displayed with both scientific precision and cultural reverence, Jackson noted the transformed atmosphere surrounding the discovery. The initial institutional attempts to claim exclusive control had given way to something his grandfather might have deemed far more valuable: collaborative understanding that respected multiple knowledge systems. Yet the path hadn't been without challenges. The public announcement of the chamber's discovery had triggered intense controversy in academic circles, with established archaeological authorities initially dismissing the findings as misinterpreted or even fraudulent. Major universities and museums had withheld support, questioning the unorthodox stewardship model that placed a farmer's family at the center of historical research. The Washington Post is running a feature tomorrow, Daniel mentioned, showing Jackson a preview on his tablet. They're calling it The Farmer Who Rewrote History, not exactly subtle but certainly accurate. The turning point in public perception had come 6 weeks after the discovery, when independent verification from 3 prestigious international universities had confirmed the authenticity and significance of the artifacts. This external validation, coupled with the involvement of indigenous knowledge keepers whose traditional wisdom provided essential context for interpreting the findings, had transformed scholarly skepticism into cautious enthusiasm. The financial impact on the Miller farm had been equally transformative. While the land remained under family ownership, research grants, documentary licensing fees, and educational programs had generated more revenue in 3 months than the previous decade of farming. More importantly, the collaborative model established through the Miller Family Trust ensured that financial benefits extended to participating tribal nations and local community development. We've finalized the educational resource sharing program, Daniel informed the group, leading them toward the newly constructed learning center where digital models of key artifacts could be accessed by schools worldwide. Starting next month, students from participating tribal schools will engage in direct knowledge exchange with our research teams, integrating indigenous understanding with archaeological methodology. This approach, valuing experience-based wisdom alongside academic expertise, reflected what Jackson had come to recognize as his grandfather's most revolutionary insight: that true understanding emerges not from institutional authority, but from the respectful integration of different ways of knowing. As the tour proceeded to the specialized conservation area, a lanky teenager in jeans and a Miller Farm t-shirt approached Jackson with urgent energy. "Mr. Miller, we've completed the 3D rendering of the Celestial Navigation System," said Jamie Two Hawks, a high school student from the Standing Rock Reservation who had demonstrated remarkable aptitude for digital modeling. When we overlay the star positions with modern astronomical software, it shows something incredible. The group followed Jamie to the digital visualization lab, where a holographic display showed the central keystone star patterns projected against both ancient and modern night skies. If we use the chamber's own dating system, Jamie explained, manipulating the model with practiced ease, and project the sky as it would have appeared during the specific celestial alignment marked here, which occurs only once every 432 years, we can identify exactly when the knowledge exchange would have occurred. The display shifted, showing a perfect alignment between the keystone markings and a stellar configuration dated to 1215 CE. This matches exactly with the carbon dating, Dr. Santiago confirmed, her professional composure momentarily giving way to genuine wonder. But it also corresponds with documented maritime expeditions from multiple cultural traditions that conventional history has never connected to North America. The implications rippled through the assembled experts, evidence not just of cultural contact between indigenous North Americans and Norse explorers, as some had theorized, but of a multi-civilization exchange involving possible contacts from across the Atlantic and Pacific simultaneously. My grandfather spent decades preserving this knowledge when the academic world wasn't ready to receive it, Jackson observed quietly. Now we're witnessing exactly why his patience mattered. The afternoon's presentations continued, each revealing new facets of the extraordinary repository Harold Miller had protected. Linguistic analyses suggested communication systems that predated currently accepted timelines for written language in North America. Metallurgical studies of ceremonial objects revealed alloy compositions that implied technological exchange far beyond what conventional history had acknowledged. Astronomical alignments documented celestial knowledge that rivaled European understanding from the same period. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the research center's grounds, Jackson stepped outside for a moment of reflection. The fields that had once represented his family's precarious financial state now symbolized something far more enduring. A living legacy that transcended conventional boundaries between academic disciplines, between cultural traditions, and between ways of knowing. Professor Blackwood approached, his institutional demeanor softened by months of collaborative work. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Miller," he said, joining Jackson at the property's edge. "When we first arrived, I saw only artifacts to be preserved and studied according to established protocols. I failed to recognize that your grandfather's approach to stewardship represented a more profound preservation, not just of objects, but of their meaning and context." Jackson accepted the acknowledgement with a nod. Grandpa used to say that artifacts without stories are just interesting objects, but stories without proof are easily dismissed. He preserved both because he understood they're inseparable. This integrated approach had become the center's hallmark, the Miller model, as it was now being called in academic circles, a collaborative framework that honored indigenous knowledge, alongside scientific methodology that valued family stewardship, alongside institutional expertise that recognized farmers could sometimes see what professors might miss. As they returned to the main facility for the evening reception, Jackson noted how the chamber's discovery had transformed not just his family's circumstances, but the entire community. Willow Creek Valley, once facing economic collapse as family farm succumbed to corporate development, had found new vitality as a center for historical tourism and educational programs. Local families who had been on the verge of selling their generational lands now found employment opportunities connected to the research center. The Amberwood development proposal for the Thompson property has been withdrawn, Daniel mentioned, showing Jackson an email notification. They're citing changed community circumstances as the official reason, but everyone knows the real story. No one's selling to developers now that sustainable alternatives exist. This ripple effect, economic revitalization rooted in cultural preservation rather than exploitation, represented perhaps the most meaningful validation of Harold Miller's decades-long commitment. He had protected historical knowledge not as an abstract academic exercise, but as a living resource that could revitalize communities and restore broken connections. Inside the reception hall, traditional foods prepared by tribal community members were being served alongside local farm produce, symbolizing the integration of indigenous wisdom and agricultural heritage that defined the center's approach. Conversations flowed between academic researchers and traditional knowledge keepers, each bringing complementary perspectives to the ongoing interpretation of the chamber's contents. Dr. Santiago raised her glass for a toast. To Harold Miller, she began, whose vision preserved this extraordinary knowledge, and to Jackson and Daniel Miller, whose commitment to their grandfather's principles created something unprecedented, a truly collaborative approach to understanding our shared past. As glasses were raised across the room, Jackson felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy not as a burden, but as an inspiration. The desperate last-ditch effort to save his failing farm had uncovered far more than archaeological treasure. It had revealed a pathway toward reconciliation between knowledge systems long held separate. Later that evening, after the visitors had departed for their accommodations in the newly revitalized Willow Creek town center, the Miller brothers sat on their grandfather's porch, sharing a quiet moment beneath the same stars that had guided ancient navigators to unexpected cultural exchanges. "Sometimes I still can't quite believe it," Daniel said, looking out over the illuminated research facility that now stood where bankruptcy had once loomed. "A few months ago, we were weeks away from losing everything. Now we're helping rewrite history books." Jackson nodded, feeling both the responsibility and satisfaction of their unexpected journey. "Grandpa knew this moment would come," he replied. "He preserved the chamber for exactly this purpose, not as an academic curiosity or institutional treasure, but as a bridge between ways of understanding that had been artificially separated." Above them, the same stellar configurations documented in the chamber's artifacts wheeled slowly across the night sky. As they had for millennia, the astronomical knowledge preserved in the repository had proven remarkably precise, documenting celestial cycles with an accuracy that challenged assumptions about prehistoric scientific understanding. "The timing wasn't coincidence," Jackson continued thoughtfully. "Grandpa could have revealed the chamber decades ago, but the academic world wasn't ready then. Indigenous perspectives were marginalized, alternative theories about cultural contact were dismissed without consideration. But now, with established narratives already being questioned, people can see the evidence with open minds." As darkness settled fully over the Miller farm, the subtle illumination from the research center created a gentle glow across the property. reminiscent of the protective atmosphere that had surrounded the original chamber. Similar centers were now being established across the continent, as other families came forward with preserved knowledge, artifacts, and stories that conventional history had overlooked or dismissed. Jackson thought of his grandfather's final journal entry, written just weeks before his death. The repository was never primarily about artifacts or even historical claims. It was about reconnection, helping divided knowledge systems recognize their common origins and shared wisdom. The physical evidence matters, but the real treasure is remembering that human understanding flourishes through exchange, not isolation. The underground chamber, once a closely guarded secret, had yielded something far more valuable than its remarkable artifacts. It had revealed a different approach to knowledge, not as property to be claimed or authority to be asserted, but as a collaborative endeavor that flourished when multiple perspectives converged. Jackson Miller hadn't just saved his family farm. He had helped manifest his grandfather's true legacy, hope for a world where wisdom flows across artificial boundaries of discipline and culture, where farmers and professors and indigenous elders might recognize their complementary contributions to understanding a shared human story. Sometimes Jackson reflected, as the stars continued their ancient patterns overhead, the most valuable discoveries remain hidden until precisely the right moment to be revealed, and the most desperate circumstances can yield the most profound opportunities for those willing to dig deeper than conventional wisdom allows. 1 year after Jackson Miller's discovery had transformed both his family's destiny and the landscape of North American archaeology, he stood at the podium of the United Nations Educational Summit in New York City. The journey from bankrupt farmer to keynote speaker at an international conference represented a transformation he could never have imagined while desperately excavating his failing fields that fateful morning. The most valuable discoveries often remain hidden in plain sight, Jackson began, his farmer's practical demeanor now tempered with the quiet confidence of someone who had found his true purpose. Not because they're deliberately concealed, but because we've been trained to look through certain lenses while ignoring others. The packed auditorium held representatives from 147 nations, indigenous communities from 6 continents, and educational leaders who had gathered to learn about what was now being called the Miller approach to integrated knowledge systems. The model pioneered at Willow Creek Valley had sparked a global reconsideration of how different forms of understanding could complement rather than compete with one another. My grandfather wasn't formally educated beyond high school, Jackson continued, advancing to an image of Harold Miller standing beside a young Smithsonian researcher in 1953. But he possessed something equally valuable, the wisdom to recognize that truth doesn't belong exclusively to institutions, disciplines, or traditions. It emerges most clearly when multiple perspectives converge on common ground. In the front row sat Daniel, now directing a nationwide educational initiative that brought indigenous knowledge keepers into partnership with university researchers. Beside him was Dr. Santiago, whose willingness to challenge archaeological orthodoxy had opened institutional doors that might otherwise have remained closed. Professor Blackwood, initially the strongest voice for institutional control, had become an unexpected ally, leveraging his academic standing to advocate for collaborative approaches to historical understanding. The chamber my grandfather protected for decades has yielded extraordinary artifacts. Jackson acknowledged, showing images of the repository's most significant discoveries. But the true treasure wasn't the objects themselves. It was the methodology they represented, a sophisticated integration of astronomical observation, mathematical precision, and cultural wisdom that defied categorization according to conventional academic boundaries. The educational model that had emerged from the Miller Farm discovery now operated at 3 levels: preserving physical artifacts through collaborative stewardship, documenting multiple interpretative frameworks without privileging any single perspective, and implementing educational approaches that taught students to synthesize insights from diverse knowledge traditions. When my backhoe struck stone that morning, I was simply a desperate farmer trying to save his family land, Jackson admitted, his authenticity resonating through the auditorium. I had no idea I was about to uncover not just archaeological treasures, but a methodology that would transform how we understand knowledge itself. The impact of the discovery had extended far beyond academic circles. The Miller Family Trust, established to oversee the Chamber's artifacts and research, had developed a revolutionary benefit-sharing model that directed resources to participating tribal nations, local community development, and educational initiatives worldwide. Rather than centralizing control through traditional institutional hierarchies, the Trust operated through a distributed governance system that ensured all stakeholders maintained meaningful participation. The colonial approach to knowledge treated wisdom as property to be claimed, controlled, and commodified, Jackson explained, his straightforward farmer's perspective cutting through academic jargon. My grandfather recognized something profound, that understanding flourishes through connection, not possession. The chamber he protected wasn't meant to establish new academic authorities or rewrite history according to a single narrative. It was designed to demonstrate how multiple stories could coexist within a shared framework of truth. This integrated approach had catalyzed remarkable collaborations over the past year. Schools on tribal reservations now engaged in two-way knowledge exchange with major research universities. Traditional ecological wisdom was being incorporated into climate science models. Ancient agricultural practices preserved in the Chamber's records were being adapted to address contemporary food security challenges. The most powerful moment in our journey wasn't when we discovered priceless artifacts, Jackson reflected, advancing to an image of teenagers from diverse backgrounds working side by side in the research center. It was watching a 17-year-old indigenous student explain celestial navigation techniques to a distinguished astronomy professor, and seeing both their understandings deepen through the exchange. The educational framework developed at the Miller Research Center had spread to 213 institutions across 37 countries in just 12 months, an unprecedented rate of adoption for a pedagogical model. Its core principles emphasized reciprocal learning relationships, recognition of diverse knowledge systems, and practical application of integrated understanding to contemporary challenges. When knowledge is hoarded, it stagnates, Jackson continued. When it's shared across artificial boundaries, between disciplines, between cultures, between generations, it creates possibilities none could have imagined alone. The transformation of Willow Creek Valley offered a compelling case study in the practical benefits of this approach. Once facing economic collapse as family farms succumbed to corporate development, The region had established a thriving economy based on educational, tourism, research partnerships, and sustainable agriculture informed by traditional practices documented in the chamber. The corporate developers who once pressured farmers to sell their land are now seeking partnerships with the Knowledge Center, Jackson noted with a hint of ironic satisfaction. Not because we defeated them in some adversarial struggle, but because we demonstrated a more compelling vision of progress, one that builds upon cultural heritage rather than erasing it. Amberwood Development Corporation, which had once targeted the valley for commercial development, had recently established an educational foundation supporting indigenous knowledge preservation, a remarkable reversal prompted not by legal mandates, but by shifting public values and economic realities. The Chamber's most profound lesson wasn't about who first contacted North America or which civilization developed which technology, Jackson emphasized. It was about how knowledge itself evolves most powerfully, not through institutional pronouncements or academic territorialism, but through respectful integration of different ways of seeing and knowing. This philosophical insight had practical implications across disciplines. Medical researchers were now exploring traditional healing methodologies documented in the Chamber's artifacts. Agricultural scientists were implementing ancient crop rotation, systems that promised greater resilience in the face of climate change. Astronomers were reconsidering historical observations recorded through indigenous symbolic systems. My grandfather understood something essential about knowledge, Jackson said, his voice quieting as he shared a passage from Harold Miller's journals that had become something of a manifesto for the educational movement. He wrote, "Truth doesn't belong to anyone. It belongs to everyone or no one. Our task isn't to claim it, but to cultivate conditions where it can emerge from the intersection of different perspectives, each offering pieces of a larger understanding none could grasp alone." This wisdom had guided the Miller family trust's approach to managing both the physical artifacts and the intellectual frameworks they represented. Rather than asserting ownership or control, the trust facilitated access and exchange, creating platforms where diverse interpretations could be documented, evaluated, and synthesized without erasing their distinctive characteristics. The greatest threat to understanding isn't ignorance, Jackson observed. It's the illusion of complete knowledge. The belief that any single perspective, no matter how well established, can fully encompass complex realities. As Jackson concluded his address, he showed a final image, the night sky above the Miller farm, captured using both modern astronomical equipment and traditional indigenous observational methods. The resulting composite revealed patterns and relationships neither approach had identified independently. "This is the promise of integrated knowledge," he said simply, "not compromising truth to accommodate different viewpoints, but recognizing that truth itself emerges most fully when we cultivate the humility to learn across boundaries we once thought impermeable." The standing ovation that followed wasn't merely a response to an inspiring presentation. It represented recognition of a fundamental shift in how knowledge itself might be approached in a world where complex challenges increasingly defied single discipline solutions. After the presentation, the United Nations Educational Committee formally adopted the Miller Principles as guiding framework for a global initiative supporting collaborative knowledge systems. The announcement represented unprecedented international commitment to approaches once dismissed as fringe alternatives to established academic methodologies. Later that evening, at a reception overlooking the Manhattan skyline, Jackson found himself speaking with Dr. Amira Hassan, the UNESCO Director of Educational Innovation. "Your grandfather's vision went far beyond preserving artifacts," she observed. "He recognized something profound about knowledge itself, that it flourishes through connection rather than competition." Jackson nodded, still somewhat overwhelmed by how far his family's influence had extended beyond their modest Midwestern farm. "He used to tell me that a good farmer knows more than just his own fields," Jackson replied. "He studies what neighbors are doing, what ancestors did, what scientists are discovering, and then weaves it all together into something that works in the actual soil beneath his feet." This practical wisdom, valuing both traditional knowledge and innovative approaches without treating either as exclusively authoritative, had become the hallmark of what educational theorists were now calling Miller integration. The approach resisted both rigid traditionalism and untethered innovation, instead creating frameworks where multiple knowledge systems could mutually inform and enhance one another. "The timing of your discovery wasn't coincidental," Dr. Hassan noted, gesturing toward a nearby group of indigenous knowledge keepers in conversation with university researchers. "The world was ready for this shift. The old paradigms were already straining against contemporary challenges. You provided not just evidence of alternative historical narratives, but a methodology for moving beyond the limitations of conventional knowledge frameworks. Indeed, the past year had witnessed remarkable acceleration in cross-disciplinary collaboration. Indigenous fire management practices were being integrated into forest conservation policies. Traditional agricultural techniques were enhancing sustainable farming approaches. Ancient architectural principles were informing climate-adaptive building designs. "My grandfather protected the chamber until the right moment," Jackson acknowledged. "He understood that evidence alone wouldn't be sufficient. The intellectual context needed to be receptive." That receptivity had emerged from growing recognition of the limitations inherent in conventional academic silos. Climate change, biodiversity loss, food security challenges, and cultural displacement had created problems that defied single-discipline solutions. The Miller approach offered a methodology for integration without homogenization, for bringing diverse knowledge systems into productive dialogue without erasing their distinctive characteristics. As the reception continued, Jackson stepped onto the balcony for a moment of reflection. The Manhattan skyline gleamed with technological achievement, yet he found himself thinking of the stars above his farm. The same celestial patterns that had guided the knowledge exchange documented in his grandfather's chamber centuries earlier. Daniel joined him, carrying 2 glasses of champagne. "Not bad for a couple of bankrupt farmers," he observed with a grin, handing his brother a glass. "From foreclosure notices to United Nations resolutions in 12 months. Jackson smiled, remembering the desperate circumstances that had driven him to that final excavation attempt, the looming bank deadlines, the corporate pressure to sell, the community skepticism about his decision to follow his grandfather's cryptic maps. "Remember what Dad used to say about farming?" he asked. "The darkest soil grows the strongest roots. I think about that a lot lately." Daniel nodded, understanding the metaphor. The brothers had emerged from near financial ruin into an entirely unexpected purpose, not merely preserving their family farm, but transforming how knowledge itself might be cultivated across traditional boundaries. "I got another call from Amberwood Development today," Daniel mentioned after a moment. "They're proposing a comprehensive partnership, educational facilities on all their properties, collaborative governance with local communities, profit sharing with tribal nations whose territories they operate in." "The same corporation that tried to buy every farm in Willow Creek Valley for commercial development?" Jackson asked, raising an eyebrow. "The very same," Daniel confirmed. "Their CEO is speaking at tomorrow's session about transformative business models inspired by indigenous wisdom. Apparently near bankruptcy and public relations disasters create excellent soil for corporate evolution." The brothers shared a knowing laugh, appreciating the irony of former adversaries becoming allies. Yet this transformation reflected the broader impact of the Miller approach, creating frameworks where seemingly opposed interests could identify common ground and mutual benefit. "I sometimes wonder what Grandpa would think of all this," Jackson mused, gazing out at the city lights. He spent decades protecting those artifacts in absolute secrecy, and now they're the foundation for a global educational movement. "He'd recognize it as the fruition of his vision," Daniel replied confidently. "He wasn't hiding the chamber to keep knowledge secret. He was preserving it until the world was ready to receive it in the right spirit." That readiness had emerged from a convergence of factors: growing recognition of indigenous rights, increasing awareness of climate change challenges, rising public interest in alternative historical narratives, and technological platforms that facilitated knowledge exchange across traditional boundaries. "Mr. Miller," called a voice from the doorway. They turned to see a group of young people, university students who had been selected as Miller Fellows in the inaugural cohort of the Integrated Knowledge Program. "We wanted to thank you personally," said a young woman who introduced herself as Layla Begay, a Navajo student studying both astrophysics and traditional star knowledge. "Your family's approach has created opportunities many of us never thought possible, to honor our traditional wisdom while engaging with contemporary science without being forced to choose between them." This integration without assimilation represented the heart of the Miller approach, creating educational frameworks where diverse knowledge systems could maintain their distinctive characteristics while engaging in productive dialogue. Students trained in this methodology demonstrated remarkable ability to synthesize insights from multiple traditions, developing innovative solutions to complex challenges. "The credit belongs to my grandfather," Jackson replied honestly. "He recognized something essential about knowledge that institutions had forgotten, that understanding emerges most powerfully at the intersection of different ways of seeing the world." As Jackson spoke with the students about their research, he reflected on how profoundly his own understanding had evolved over the past year. The desperate farmer who had excavated his field that morning had been focused solely on financial survival, on finding something, anything, that might save his family's land from foreclosure. What he had uncovered instead was a methodology for bridging divided knowledge systems, for creating dialogue across boundaries that had long separated academic disciplines, cultural traditions, and generational wisdom. The financial security that followed had been welcome, certainly, but the true transformation lay in discovering purpose beyond mere survival. Later that night, unable to sleep despite the luxury of his Manhattan hotel room, Jackson found himself Rereading his grandfather's journals, one passage in particular resonated with the day's events. "Knowledge isn't something we possess," Harold Miller had written in 1992. "It's something we cultivate together." The chamber isn't ultimately about artifacts or historical claims. It's about demonstrating a better way of understanding, one that honors multiple perspectives, not out of some vague notion of inclusivity, but because truth itself emerges most clearly when viewed through different lenses simultaneously. This insight had transformed not just archaeological methodology, but educational approaches across disciplines. The Miller Center now hosted regular knowledge exchange programs, where academic researchers and traditional wisdom keepers shared perspectives on contemporary challenges, from climate adaptation to cultural preservation, from sustainable agriculture to ethical technology development. The morning brought the final day of the United Nations Summit, culminating in the formal announcement of the Global Integrated Knowledge Initiative, a multinational effort to document, preserve, and synthesize diverse knowledge systems worldwide. The program would establish regional centers modeled after the Miller approach, creating platforms for collaboration between academic institutions, indigenous communities, and local knowledge traditions. As Jackson prepared for the signing ceremony, he received an unexpected message, an email containing photographs of a newly discovered chamber in the highlands of Peru. The images showed stone carvings with astronomical alignments remarkably similar to those found beneath the Miller farm, suggesting a cultural exchange network far more extensive than even the most optimistic researchers had hypothesized. "It's happening exactly as your grandfather predicted," Dr. Santiago noted when Jackson shared the images with her before the ceremony. He wrote in his final journal entry that once the first chamber was properly understood, others would emerge, not because they weren't known before, but because people would finally recognize what they were seeing. Indeed, the past year had witnessed a remarkable acceleration in rediscovered knowledge repositories worldwide. Local communities who had protected cultural heritage sites for generations were now coming forward, recognizing in the Miller approach a methodology that respected their stewardship while facilitating broader understanding. The chamber was never meant to be unique, Jackson realized. It was one node in a network of knowledge exchange that spanned continents centuries before conventional history acknowledged such connections were possible. This recognition had profound implications not just for historical understanding, but for contemporary approaches to global challenges. If diverse civilizations had developed sophisticated methodologies for sharing knowledge across cultural and geographical boundaries centuries ago, perhaps their approaches offered insights for addressing modern divisions between scientific disciplines, cultural traditions, and technological paradigms. As the signing ceremony began, Jackson found himself seated between a Harvard archaeology professor and an elder from the Oneida Nation, a positioning that symbolized the integrated approach the initiative represented. The formal declaration emphasized principles that would have been considered radical in academic circles just years earlier: reciprocal learning relationships, recognition of diverse knowledge systems as equally valuable, and commitment to accessibility over institutional exclusivity. When Jackson was invited to make the closing remarks, he set aside his prepared speech and instead spoke directly from his farmer's perspective. "My grandfather used to say that good soil isn't created by any single element. It emerges from The interaction of minerals, microbes, water and air. No component alone makes fertile ground, but together they create conditions where life flourishes. Knowledge works the same way. It's not about choosing between tradition and innovation, between academic expertise and lived experience, between scientific methodology and cultural wisdom. It's about creating conditions where these different elements can interact productively, generating understanding richer than any could produce alone. The metaphor resonated through the assembly, a practical farmer's insight cutting through academic complexity to illuminate a pathway forward. The global initiative wasn't merely about preserving diverse knowledge systems as museum artifacts. It was about creating living exchanges that could generate new insights for addressing contemporary challenges. A year ago, I was a bankrupt farmer making one last desperate attempt to save my family's land, Jackson concluded. What I discovered beneath those failing fields wasn't just archaeological treasure. It was a methodology for cultivating understanding. Across boundaries we once thought impermeable. If that approach could transform a failing farm into a center for global innovation, imagine what it might accomplish when applied to our most pressing challenges. As international representatives signed the formal declaration, Jackson felt the weight of his grandfather's legacy not as a burden, but as an inspiration. Harold Miller hadn't merely preserved artifacts, he had protected a methodology for integrated understanding until the world was ready to receive it. The desperate last-ditch effort to save a family farm had uncovered something far more valuable than financial salvation. It had revealed a pathway toward reconciliation between knowledge systems long held separate. The bankrupt farmer's final harvest had yielded not just historical artifacts, but a transformative approach to knowledge itself, one that recognized wisdom could flourish in fields far beyond academic walls, in traditions dismissed as primitive, in practices overlooked. By institutional expertise, by digging deeper than conventional wisdom allowed, Jackson Miller had unearthed not just his family's salvation, but a methodology for cultivating understanding across the artificial boundaries that had long divided human knowledge. As he gazed across the assembly of global leaders now committed to this integrated approach, Jackson recalled his grandfather's favorite saying about farming: "The most valuable growth happens underground, where nobody sees it, until suddenly, there it is breaking through the surface, changing everything." Sometimes the most profound discoveries remain hidden until precisely the right moment to emerge, and the most desperate circumstances can yield the most transformative opportunities for those willing to dig deeper than conventional wisdom allows. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.